Come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled, "How Can the U.S. Make Development Banks More Accountable?" I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. The origins of multilateral development banks, or MDBs, lie within the creation of the World Bank at the Bretton Woods in 1944. Today, the MBDs include not only the World Bank and its other lending arms, the IBRD, the International Development Association, IDA, but also 4 regional banks, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. Their core mission is to provide financial assistance such as loans and grants to developing countries to promote economic and social development. The multi-development banks, or MDBs, can provide capital to sustain MDB operations. Member countries are awarded shares in MDBs in proportion to the amount of capital that they provide. Because member nations provide the MDBs with a large capital base, the MDBs have a AAA credit rating, which allows them to borrow at favorable rates from private lenders. Because the United States is a member of each of these institutions, Congress plays a very important role in determining U.S. funding for those MDBs and engaging in the oversight of the administration's participation in the MDBs. Although the Treasury Department represents the U.S. at the MDBs and negotiates the amounts committed to them for general capital increases and the replenishment of concessional loan windows, only Congress has the constitutional authority to authorize and appropriate the funds required to fulfill these commitments. The U.S. Constitution details the power as well as the limitations of each branch of government. As the legislative branch of government, Congress is the one to make laws of the United States of America. Additionally, it is Congress, and Congress alone, not the President or any other branch, that controls appropriations and funding. On previous occasions, the Treasury has pledged money to an MDB without consulting Congress to the degree I believe it should, and then criticized this very body for not appropriating the full amount and failing to meet those commitments. In fact, Treasury has falsely claimed that Congress damaged U.S. credibility by failing to deliver on policy commitments made by Treasury that they have not the authority to make. It is important to note that some have said that the cost of funding the U.S. commitment to MDBs outweighs the benefits derived from them. This is because those MDBs have not necessarily supported U.S. interests, failed to meet their development goals, and failed to sufficiently combat corruption and abuses of individual rights in the nations that receive that MDB support. This is one of particular interest for me. Others have called MDBs to focus more on public goods in order to minimize the risk of crowding out private lenders in that same space. Currently, the Obama administration is undertaking negotiations for a 3-year replenishment of the World Bank's and African Development Bank's concessional loan windows, and also in discussions to how to alter the other institutions, including the Inter-American Development Bank, finance future initiatives. Lastly, the administration has proposed a doubling of the North American Development Bank, also known as NAD Bank, doubling their capital, the first such increase since its inception around the time of NAFTA. Today's hearing will examine the administration's plans regarding these matters, many of which are contingent on congressional authorization, while addressing whether development banks are improving outcomes for low-income beneficiaries in a cost-effective manner. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Sheets, I want to welcome you again to the committee. I've read your testimony, and I think you make some really powerful points on the utility and power of these utility banks. You know, I'm a card-carrying liberal with an incredibly deep and personal connection to the least, the last, and the lost in this country and around the world. So I don't think that I'm going to shock anyone to say that I believe the United States has a moral obligation to help poor people anywhere they are. But I'm also a realist. The United States can't do this alone. We must leverage our commitment with other countries in the world and with private capital. And I think America is helping Americans when we support the work of development banks. It is just amazing to think about the close nexus of providing assistance and aid to people who are marginalized in maintaining our national security interests. We've talked about the importance of opening global markets around here a lot. And we don't do that by waving some sort of wand. We do that by supporting these development banks. These development banks can play an expanding role in helping business operate in some of these markets. Now, I don't want to rehash all of your points that you make in your written testimony, but I do want to make one point related to our development bank policy. As great a tool as this can be, we have to do it the right way. So I want to emphasize the need for a strong, enforceable safeguard regimen. I also want to flag for you a letter I wrote to the IFC about its conflict policy. I get it that we want to be creative and leverage private capital in these projects, and I'm all for it. But this letter is about how to do it the right way. And I consider this to be an ongoing dialogue, so I'm not going to labor the point, but I do want to make sure that we're looking at these programs and these monies, and we do it the right way. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. With that, today we welcome the testimony of Dr. Nathan Sheets, who is the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs. Dr. Sheets was confirmed by the United States Senate on September 8 of 2014 to serve as the U.S. Department of Treasury's Undersecretary for International Affairs. Prior to joining Treasury, he was the Global Head of International Economics at Citigroup, a position he held since September of 2011. And prior to joining Citigroup, Dr. Sheets worked at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System for 18 years, where he worked closely with his international counterparts, including as Director of the Board's Division of International Finance and Economist to the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee. And he has a deep background in this, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. You'll be recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral presentation, Dr. Sheets, and without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. So, Mr. Undersecretary, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huizenga, Ranking Member Moore, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss Treasury's role working with the multilateral development banks, or MDBs. Through our leadership in the World Bank, the regional development banks, and the International Monetary Fund, the United States effectively influences global economic events, promotes American values, supports our allies, and helps drive inclusive growth and poverty reduction at home and around the world. The MDBs in particular play a vital role in the international system and in advancing American interests. First, the MDBs support development through investments that are not possible with private capital and domestic resources alone. They provide grants and highly concessional loans to low-income countries and loans to middle-income countries. Without such support, even countries with access to capital markets may not be able to attract sufficient capital in terms consistent with the sustainability of their debt. MDBs also catalyze private sector investment and provide technical assistance, research, and data. Second, the MDBs are important contributors to U.S. national security by playing a leading role in assisting key strategic partners such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, and Mali. Third, the MDBs support countries undertaking valuable reforms, including strengthening governance, building accountable institutions, mobilizing domestic resources, and fighting money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Fourth, by supporting long-term development, the MDBs help foster economic growth and fiscal sustainability, which reduces the likelihood of macroeconomic crises and countries' potential need for IMF financing. Regional development banks complement the World Bank's reach through expertise in areas of importance to their respective regions, which developing countries strongly value. For instance, the African Development Bank focuses on infrastructure, regional integration, and food security. The Inter-American Development Bank has expertise in social protection and the development of small and medium-sized enterprises. Notably, the North American Development Bank plays a unique role through its mandate to finance environmental infrastructure on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border. Treasury is working to ensure that the MDBs continue to deliver on these important roles while improving their financial and operational efficiency and further strengthening their accountability and governance. As the largest shareholder in all but the African Development Bank, the United States is well positioned to encourage the MDBs to implement such reforms. Treasury is pushing the MDBs to improve their financial efficiency. The MDBs offer the United States significant financial leverage. The $1.8 billion request for the MDBs in the President's proposed budget should support more than $100 billion in MDB investments in developing countries. And the MDBs are taking steps to make their resources go further. The Asian Development Bank's reforms here are particularly compelling. We will see an increase in lending capacity while allowing donors to significantly reduce contributions. To complement efforts to boost financial efficiency, Treasury is advocating for the MDBs to enhance their operational efficiency, including streamlining project approval processes and improving project preparation. The MDBs should take such steps without compromising high social, environmental, and fiduciary standards. Treasury continues to work to improve accountability and good governance at these institutions. The MDBs must measure success by project outcomes rather than by the amount of financing provided. And the MDBs must reform their governance structures to reflect the changing economic realities of shareholders in fair and transparent ways. As emerging markets seek greater influence in the MDBs, Treasury asks these countries to assume greater responsibilities, including increasing their role as donors and gradually moving away from MDB borrowing. As we push for continued improvements at the MDBs, the United States must also fulfill its responsibilities as a leader of these institutions. The MDBs will continue to need strong financial support from the United States and other shareholders, in particular for the poorest countries. Treasury asks that Congress support the administration's request for the FY 2017 budget so that MDBs can provide financing to the poorest. For the past 70 years, U.S. leadership has ensured that the MDBs and the IMF have remained critical partners in supporting U.S. strategic and economic priorities. It is crucial that the United States and these institutions, working together, continue to deliver on those priorities, including supporting peace, security, and sustainable economic growth. Thank you, and I very much welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Undersecretary. At this point, I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. I want to touch on a number of issues. One first thing before I get into sort of the IMF negotiations with Euro group in Greece and some other things. I want to talk a little bit about structure. I understand that the Asian Development Bank has, by a vote of its board, combined both its hard and its soft loan portfolios as they're dealing with it. Can you give us a quick update, very quickly, as to how that is working, and is that the model, one of the things that's being used in some of the other reforms for the other development banks?
That's right. The consolidation of these two windows at the Asian Development Bank we see indeed as being a model or a template for the other MDBs going forward. And specifically as a result of this consolidation, the capacity of the bank to lend both concessionally and non-concessionally has been increased by about 40%. And at the same time, the necessary replenishments to its non-concessional or to its concessional window have been reduced by more than 40%.
So less paid in
exactly.
direct dollars
less
because they're now
more
using
out on the
Yep.
other side.
Okay. Which makes a ton of sense
Yes.
to me, so I want to encourage that. And then who actually negotiates the numbers and the increases with the various NDBs and with the other member nations? Is that you specifically, or is that Secretary Liu? Who's involved in that negotiation process?
So broadly speaking, it would be the leadership at the Treasury. We have a deputy assistant secretary who would be the point person that would be attending the meetings, but then it would be approved all the way up the line.
Yourself.
Including myself and the secretary.
And Secretary Lou.
Approving that.
All right. Well,
that
and as I had said in my opening statement, there have been some concern about Congress, House and Senate, and from the public comments from the administration, a lack of willingness to support what they had negotiated. It seems to me a critical function to that would be getting us on board from the very beginning, which necessitates communication, and I hope that you'll be committed to working with myself, working with the appropriations folks here in the House, so that we can not have this conflict on that.
Indeed, we are very, very much open to that. We try to do our best, and we'll continue to engage as necessary.
So in the 2.5 minutes that I have left, I want to talk a little bit about the progress on corruption and human rights, and whether the MDBs have had that. And I think I'm going to actually follow that up with a written question. Because I do want to hit, for you to clarify, the current state of IMF negotiations with the Eurogroup and Greece. According to IMF rules, any country whose debt is found to be unsustainable, a so-called red zone country, cannot receive exceptional access assistance unless its debt is restructured to make it sustainable with high probability. Yesterday, I believe it was, or maybe the day before, we had an article in Wall Street Journal about negotiations stalled between Greece and the international creditors, I expressed this to Managing Director Lagarde earlier, or I guess the end of last week. I've expressed this to Secretary Lou when I last saw him. I want to make sure that we are not setting ourselves up for even an appearance of another Greek bailout when the Greeks aren't willing to do what's necessary to right the ship. So if you'd please comment on that.
So the status of these negotiations between the Greeks and their European partners and the IMF, this is an issue that we follow very closely on at least a day-to-day basis. I think the fundamental point that I would make is very consistent with the point that you were making, that the IMF has made clear that it will be involved in a Greek program in the sense of providing resources only if they are convinced that the reform program that's being put forward is a significant one, and it's one where the Greek authorities themselves have significant ownership. So that is a first condition that the IMF has made very clear, that this is a significant reform program. The Greeks have made progress over the last 5 years, but they still have work to do, and it's imperative that.
So can you assure us today that Greece will not have access to that exceptional lending mechanism?
Yes, and then the second. That
was a yes acknowledging the question, or a yes to the question?
I would say to both, but let me say, the second condition, which bears specifically on what you're saying, is that the IMF has made clear will only provide resources to the Greeks if the program is accompanied by significant debt relief from Greece's European partners to ensure that that condition of debt sustainability that you articulated is satisfied. And let me further say that the IMF's position on requiring a strong program and only joining the program if there's significant debt relief is very much supported by the Treasury.
Okay. My time has expired. With that, I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you, Mr. Sheets, Secretary Dr. Shakes, for coming to speak with us today. As I mentioned in my opening comments, I'm very interested in some of the complexities of providing support and leveraging private capital with conflicts of interest that are raised. I did send a letter regarding, in particular, water policy. And I know that there has been some sort of complaints at local levels. I'm thinking in Manila and Nigeria about these water policies. I've come up with an astronomical figure. In Manila, for example, when the IFC, the development arm, took an equity position in the water company, water rates were raised up to 845%. That seems sort of unaffordable in any sort of monetary system. Whatever your economy is, 845% seems unaffordable. And I'm just wondering how that's helpful. In Nigeria, we have seen massive demonstrations regarding the equity investments in water. So I guess, how do we bridge the gap between the notion somehow that water is a human right? In Nigeria, they talk about an old African proverb that says that water has no enemies, but it seems like the water is getting to be quite a bit of an enemy as we see its unavailability to people. There's a notion that at some level, based on it being a human right, that there ought to be in place sort of a fixed subsidy that recognizes water as a human right, and then a charge for usage beyond this point. So question one, have you heard this? Can you comment on this? And what can we do to reduce the conflicts of interest?
Thank you. The issues that you point to are very rich and diverse, and I think really cut to the heart of the mission of the multilateral development banks. Let me just give you a few reactions to your question and a few thoughts in response, and I'd be happy to talk to you directly or have my team talk to your team. But I think that the issues you highlight, first of all, underscore the point of the necessity of there being safeguards. Yes. And the safeguards really boil down to how do we implement the best practices and the lessons learned from development bank lending over the last 70 years? How do we implement that into the ongoing processes and lending approaches of the MDBs? And it's imperative that there be appropriate firewalls and that there be appropriate development impact assessments to think about the implications of various projects on the populations that will be experiencing that. It's also important that the safeguards have adequate resources to ensure that they're implemented fully and that there's monitoring of projects afterwards. Exactly. So I think that there's a very rich set of issues regarding safeguards. I also think there's a very rich set of issues regarding what is a global public good? What is the global commons here that these MDBs are protecting? And I think protecting health of populations and providing the infrastructure to support that through water or otherwise is very much at the heart and center of their mission. And I think that how do we deliver those public goods in a way that's, on the one hand, economically feasible, but on the other hand, actually meets the real needs of the people who are being affected is a crucial question that we should be focused on and do more work on.
And, just as an extension of that, protections for women, LGBT clients, those people who are very poor. We have heard that water can reach some of the more opulent areas, and the people who are very poor don't get it. So we have got to make sure we get those safeguards in place and have more than just monitoring.
Protecting those diverse communities is, and ensuring human rights broadly is one of the aspects of the safeguards, and the social protections that are been put in place are important.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. With that, the chair recognizes the Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Mulvaney of South Carolina, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member. Thanks, Mr. Sheets, for doing this. I want to follow up and stay on a topic that the chairman started with towards the end of his questions, which is Greece. And did I hear you correctly at the end? You got asked 2 questions and you said yes to both, but I just want to go back in and make it even more clear regarding Greece's potential use of the exceptional access funds. You're saying that that's not going to happen, correct? Is that do we hear that correctly?
So what was repealed by the IMF and will not happen is the systemic exemption. So that in 2010, the IMF was looking at the situation in Greece, and there were legitimate questions about the sustainability of the debt. But there was a judgment made that at that point in time, making the Greeks restructure their debt would pose significant risks to the rest of Europe. And that was the systemic exemption. In January of this year, the IMF removed the systemic exemption. So now debt sustainability and whether or not a program is improving the sustainability of a country's debt is very much at the heart and center of every judgment that the IMF and the IMF board has to make.
And the removal of the systemic exemption was something that Congress required of the IMF in the omnibus spending bill at the end of last year, correct?
The Congress made the phasing out of this systemic exemption a requirement in order for the quota payment to be made. So it was conditional on the quota payment. It wasn't actually a requirement of the IMF. The IMF voted independently of that, but it was necessary for the U.S. to pay the quota.
All right, I've just been handed a note to ask you to clarify between the new language and the way you're going to handle this and the systemic exemption. Is there something that's taken the place of that? Or are we just talking now that the only consideration is going to be the debt restructuring and the sustainability of the debt? Is that the only issue that enters into the IMF's mind?
There is, in addition, so you have debt sustainability and whether or not the program significantly is improving that debt sustainability. Of course, there are also important governance issues. Will the country follow the program as written? And is it credible in the commitments? And frankly, those are the two prongs of what the IMF is now requiring for Greece. One, a solid program that the fund is comfortable, will achieve the objectives, and the Greeks will follow through on. And the second is debt relief to ensure that the debt is sustainable.
Correct. Now, you mentioned the relationship with the Greeks and whether or not they'll be able to carry out this program. There's some tension between the IMF right now and Greece. And by the way, and rightly so, and I'm surprised that the ranking member didn't recognize, hasn't raised this issue. In fact, I don't think many folks on the other side of the aisle have. One of the questions that we have about the IMF's role in Greece is that it's a developed country. And whether or not you like the IMF or not, it's supposed to be helping the underdeveloped countries of the world, not Greece. And that every dollar we spend helping Greece is not going to help sub-Saharan Africa. So that's sort of one of the rare bipartisan things that we agree on here. So, but let me ask you this. I'm going to go into the relationship. And I want to ask you about the leaked conversation the other day, or excuse me, earlier this month. There was the leaked conversation between the various IMF officials, one in Washington, two, I think, in Geneva, about the Greek situation. Are you familiar with that situation, Mr. Sheets?
I've read the news reports, absolutely.
Do you know if the IMF has done any investigation as to how that happened?
I don't know how the IMF has responded internally.
Okay, do we care? I mean, we're the largest funder of this. Does the United States government care how an IMF internal phone conversation got tapped and then leaked? I care.
That was a confidential conversation between senior people at the IMF. Absolutely, it should have been confidential. And as you say, as a shareholder worried about the governance of the institution, we care.
Have we done anything to find out how it happened? And here's why I wonder, because the substance of the leaked conversation, someone tapped somebody's phone and then leaked the transcripts, or actually the audio, is that the IMF may have been trying to promote some type of event in Greece prior to the July debt payments that are due in order to spur action. So I'm curious as to what we're...
The interpretation in the press of the leak, and I think I would share this, is that the source of it certainly wasn't the IMF.
The source of the leak was an IMF?
Was not.
Okay, that's fine.
The IMF was underscoring the importance there of, one, the Greeks following through on the program, and then second, in order to get the debt relief, the German authorities have been the ones that have been the most reluctant to put that on the table.
And you mentioned
those are the two parties, in some sense, that the IMF is negotiating with.
And I hope we get a chance to continue this later, because you've mentioned that a couple times about the importance of debt restructuring, and of course, one of the biggest impediments to that is the German intervention in the discussion, because they don't want that, but we maybe continue that a second time.
Yeah, be happy to speak with you bilaterally about that. Yeah.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, Chair recognizes Mr. Foster of Illinois for 5 minutes. Okay, we will, at your discretion. With that, Chair recognizes Mr. Himes of Connecticut for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we'll come back to Mr. Foster. Mr. Sheets, thanks for being with us. I just wanted to use a little bit of my time, or most of my time, to go slightly off topic and give you a little bit of time to talk about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Obviously, we've had something of a stutter-step policy with respect to that bank and how we've talked about it with our allies, several of whom obviously joined. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what you see that bank doing. In particular, obviously the criticism and the concern is that it's become an instrument for Chinese policy and strategy. I'm wondering if we're seeing that. I'm wondering if that's causing tensions within the bank. And then I wonder if you could also comment on how you see it interacting with, or perhaps competing with, other MDBs in which we have an interest.
Our view is, and has been through the discussion since the idea of an AIIB was launched, is that the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank can be a constructive addition to the global infrastructure and to the global community. If it adequately incorporates these lessons, these safeguard-like things that I've alluded to, these lessons of development bank lending over the last 70 years. So appropriate governance structures, awareness of debt sustainability, strong procurement policies, policies on environment and social safeguards, and so on and so forth. There is certainly a marked infrastructure need in Asia. So to the extent that it is implementing those projects in a way that's consistent with best practice and safe and responsible, it can be a constructive addition.
Do we have any early returns on whether that's occurring?
So we have been very vigorous in our advocacy of that position, both with the Chinese directly and with countries that are members. And what we've seen so far is that the documents, so the articles of agreement, and the documents that have been produced to support the AIIB are broadly in line with international best practice. So I would say that has been reasonably encouraging. But I think it's very important that we see how this institution actually operates, and we need to see its track record. Now, one way to achieve that is for the AIIB to do co-financing with the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, and I believe that both of those institutions are exploring options in that regard. So. The AIIB has the potential to be constructive, and we're working through every dimension that we know of, exerting leverage to try to ensure that that actually is achieved.
Is the administration giving any consideration to potentially ultimately becoming a shareholder in the bank as a mechanism for achieving that leverage?
For now, we're focused on meeting the commitments we have to existing institutions. And before any decision like that could be considered, we'd need to see a track record, and that's still quite a ways down the road, I think.
Great. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. With that, the Chair recognizes Mr. Pierce of New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Sheets, for being here. Following on the line of the questions of the Chairman and Vice Chairman, I would redirect attention to Argentina. The U.S. At the beginning of this year reversed its stance on making loans into Argentina. Could you explain why that was?
In December, Argentina had a watershed election where they elected a new government, President Macri. President Macri has made clear that economic reforms are a very important objective. They have taken significant steps to reform their economy, including freeing up the exchange rate and making that more market determined. Recently, they've concluded a 15-year period of very protracted negotiations with creditors. So the tone of the policy in Argentina has shifted significantly. In addition, some other factors have been in play, is that we had asked Argentina to take steps to normalize its relationship with Paris Club creditors.
One of the key elements.
We've seen it do.
One of the key elements appeared to be repayment of loans that they had defaulted on. Are they beginning to repay those loans to U.S. investors?
So they are through the Paris Club, and my understanding is another bit of it was the exit awards, which there were outstanding, including to El Paso Energy. And my understanding is that they have taken or are taking steps to clear those arrears.
So they're actually
as well.
paying those, or they're taking steps that might someday lead them to pay them?
You know, my understanding is that it's happening. It's either happened or is happening.
Happening.
Yes.
So again, I think Mr. Mulvaney asked the question properly. 100 years ago, Argentina was the leading economy in the U.S. in this hemisphere. U.S. was second to them. Why are we, when we're supposed to be helping underdeveloped countries, going into countries that have squandered their position for whatever reasons? And why are we doing that?
To the extent that that the World Bank is involved in Argentina, it would be, first of all, making loans on a non-concessional basis. And in general, our thinking is that the World Bank and the MDBs are best placed in middle-income countries to be focused on supporting and helping the poorest.
Have you rewritten
The poorest.
Have you rewritten your underlying goals and standards? Because much of your documentation says that you're here to help emerging countries. And if you feel like the best rate of return is in other countries, it seems like you, out of transparency, should realign your goals and realign your mission statement.
But it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So what it means to help a middle-income country like in Argentina is significantly different than what it means to help, I don't want to get into the nuances of it. I just say that what your documents say is one thing, and what you're describing to me here is completely different. And it seems like, as a matter of transparency, you'd want to realign what you tell the taxpayers or us or whoever that you're investing in. Do you? So I recently had a conversation, or I didn't have the conversation directly, but a friend was in the Peace Corps. He's my age, and spent his early years in the Peace Corps making investments, and so he had a chance to go back after 50 years and look. And he stayed with the Peace Corps. It wasn't like the 2-year stint. He stayed and became one of the managers. And so he went back and he looked 50 years afterwards, and he said the projects that we invested in are, laying in ruins now. Do y'all ever do kind of like a 20-year look at where you stuck the world's money? I mean, $100 billion, your budget here, that's a lot of money. Do you ever look 3, 4, 10 years in the past? If we were to take a look at the top 20 projects of 20 years ago, what would we find? Would we find successful, prosperous ventures, or would we find those rusting hulks that my friend from the Peace Corps talked about? Speaking bluntly, I think we'd find a mix. Some projects have been quite successful, and others much less successful. And that's very much, this kind of learning from the past is what we're trying to do in thinking about updating, modernizing, and making the governance of these institutions more efficient, and to always be drawing on
So you're talking about more efficiency. If you were to compare, and I know I'm about out of time, but if you were to compare your investments in renewable energy and oil and gas, would the renewables be more, or the oil and gas investments be more?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure we have enough track record. But let me also just say that I think that the last 15 years in Argentina have been particularly difficult. That the country has struggled severely, and what you might see in Argentina could be more problematic given their choices, the governance choices they've made, than in other middle-income countries.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, as I close here, I would just make the observation that based on your report, I would guess that the investments in the wind energy are probably significantly greater than oil and gas, for instance. And wind energy has about 12% effectiveness per dollar. And so when you're talking about efficiencies, it seems like that you'd want to be looking at those sorts of rates of return on the investment. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yield back.
gentlemen, Gentleman's time has expired. Before we go further, I've got a couple of items of business. In case we have some other members who are not part of this subcommittee, without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of the subcommittee may participate in today's hearing by asking questions of the witness. Without objection, so moved. And then I believe the ranking member has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a unanimous consent request to insert into the record correspondence referenced here at this hearing, April 12, 2016, to Dr. Kim regarding the letter I wrote to the IFC about its conflict policy.
Without objection, so ordered. All right, with that, we will return back to Mr. Foster of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Undersecretary Sheets and Mr. Chairman. Let's see, I have a couple of questions. The first has to do with, the attitude you take toward transfer unions. There's a lot of observers have said that the EU is more and more becoming a transfer union where the wealthy economies of Northern Europe, Germany, and so on are being asked to systematically bail out, Greece, other more southern countries. I think observers have also mentioned that the United States is becoming much of a transfer union. I know in my state of Illinois, about $40 billion a year leaves the state every year because we pay a lot more in federal taxes than we get back in federal spending. The net present value of all of the money that has been, wealth that has been transferred out of Illinois in the last 30 years is north of $1.5 trillion, much larger than the Greek debt, and is a large contributor to the fiscal woes of Illinois. All of that aside, you face a variety of transfer unions, everything from Northern Italy and Southern Italy to the different countries in the EU. So how do you handle this, and what is your attitude when you're determining need?
This issue is really at the heart of what it means to be a union, in that when you put together a set of somewhat heterogeneous economies like those in Europe, invariably they're going to be at different places in their business cycles and be experiencing different kinds of economic developments. And it's imperative, if you're only going to have one monetary policy and one exchange rate, that there be some kinds of flows that go from those that are doing relatively well to those that are doing that are struggling. And in the United States, we have very flexible labor markets, and that's one of the key adjustment mechanisms that we have. In Europe, the labor markets are not as flexible, and the way you kind of equilibrate these different parts of the European economy is through transfers from one part to the other. Where it gets tricky and difficult is if there is a sense that there's a structural notion to it. So it's not just during the business cycle, and sometimes one is doing well and sometimes the other is, but that structurally one part of the union is subsidizing the other part of the union. And I think there is that perception in Germany, and that is a true political economy challenge that the Germans face. On the other hand, if Germany had its own exchange rate, my sense is that it would be valued at a different place than the euro is today. So there are a number of offsetting macroeconomic considerations, but these transfers that you highlight and their sustainability is really linked to the sustainability of a union.
All right. Well, thank you. Another effort where you have considerable leverage is just in reducing corruption. There are, I think The Economist magazine is a big fan of the single most effective intervention we can do is just to discourage corruption wherever we can. And so when you look at the distribution of your efforts, how do you rank that, and do you think you spend enough of your time trying to fix the corruption problem in developing countries?
I very much agree that if there's corruption, and this may be one of the lessons of development lending over the last 70 years, that where there's corruption, it becomes essentially impossible for development policy to work, that the resources don't get to those that need them the most. And so I would say, not only would it be high, it would be an indispensable ingredient of a successful development strategy. And I know that it's one that the multilateral development banks and the IMF put a very, very high weight on.
Are there specific initiatives that would really, improve the effectiveness that have been identified? Are there successful experiments in making the finances of all of the players who are involved in corruption more transparent?
There are various case studies and approaches that have been used, some to address low-level kind of petty sorts of quote-unquote, petty corruption issues. Others for more high-level. I think the more high-level stuff is probably more legal and legal enforcement and toughening that up. The petty stuff is more systemic, and you have to think about what incentives and wages and so on and so forth are being paid to the civil service. And then there's a related issue of tax compliance and making sure that the people who owe tax actually pay tax. And there are a number of countries around the world where that's an issue. So those are sort of some of the things that I reflect on when you raise the issue of corruption. And all of them are necessary. I guess another one that's particularly important for the Treasury is that we are engaged all over the world on AML, CFT, technical assistance, and ensuring that the financial sector is free of abuse. On the
Thank
one
you. I
hand,
guess
and
my time
efficient on the other.
is up. We'll
Yes,
get back.
that's also another important. So it manifests itself in many different ways and must be fought in all those different dimensions.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Pittenger of North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sheets, appreciate this dialogue. I would like to follow up on Mr. Foster's inquiries. In reference to the operation in countries that are complicit relative to human rights and corruption, last year the Financing for Development Conference took place in Ethiopia, which ranks 103rd on the Transparency International Corruption Index, and also rated by the Freedom House as not free. How do you make the connection between that and your reference that it would not make good judgment to be providing this type of resource to a country that was complicit with corruption?
This is important, and it's important and a challenging endeavor. That there are 185 countries in the world, all of them at different places. And I think that the important thing is that we engage with these countries and do what we can to help, wherever they rank on that we're doing what we can to help move them up, at least in terms of their practices. I guess everyone can't move up simultaneously in a relative ranking, but everyone can move up simultaneously in terms of absolute standards and their expectations
Mr.
in
Sheets,
fighting corruption.
in all due respect, aren't you really setting this country up as a qualified country, is one that would be acceptable by coming and honoring them with the presence of having your meeting there? I think, to me, it says to the rest of the world that those standards are highly flexible.
Yeah, I think and certainly this would be true for Ethiopia, that we think of this as a process of hiking and working with them to press forward.
the higher you keep your standards
It's not camping and saying
and-
that anybody's perfect where they are today.
You're giving a visual to the rest of the world of what you believe is acceptable. And it seems to me, if what you are saying is correct, that you want to support countries that do not tolerate corruption, that don't tolerate human rights abuses, that we should honor those who are doing it the right way. As you look at, on another issue, given the turbulent economic trends and issues that we see in China and Russia and Brazil, do you believe that they are sustainable in terms of their engagement with AAIB and also with BRICS? Is this going to be a valid, are they going to be a valid player in the market?
So when we think of the BRICS, this is a period of greater economic uncertainty, I would say, for the BRICS than was the case, say, a decade ago. Brazil's economy is facing some significant challenges. Russia's economy, clearly, for a number of reasons, is facing significant challenges. South Africa is feeling the effects of much lower commodity prices, and the Chinese economy is gradually slowing. which I would say is a moderation and not unexpected. No economy is going to grow as fast as China was growing, but it is a slower pace of growth. Of those BRICS, I'd say the one notable exception is India, where it continues to grow at something over 7%. In terms of the specific association amongst them, they are 5 of the leading developing emerging market economies of the world. And I think that from that perspective, they have some common interests, but more broadly, they also are very heterogeneous.
I appreciate your perspective. One more question.
Please.
As far as time. Follow up to Mr. Pierce. The data that I've received shows that 65% of NADR's portfolio went to wind and solar energy efforts. So there seems to be some data out there to support that. What process is used to decide which projects deserve financing over others? And I can also look at what you've done in terms of the border states. Texas has gotten substantial amount, where Arizona has not, and neither has New Mexico. So what standards do you use that provide this type of outcome?
Which portfolio was 65% wind and solar?
The NADR's portfolio.
Got it. So the NAD Bank's mandate is to invest in environmental infrastructure. And the question that would be asked of the projects, be they wind, solar, energy, or waste management, roads, sanitation, et cetera, is what is their development impact? What's the bang for the buck, so to speak?
Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Heck of Washington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under Secretary Sheets, thank you so much for being here. One of my favorite adages is as follows: not everything that counts can be measured, and not everything that can be measured counts. Despite the fact that that's one of my favorite adages, I, in fact, conduct my life in a way that seeks to do exactly that. Informed mostly by my time in the business sector, I think it's important to be intentional, to decide what success looks like, and to attempt to measure it, and accordingly was heartened to see you say in your testimony, the MDBs must measure success by the outcomes of projects rather than the amount of financing provided. So Under Secretary Sheets, could you give a little color to what outcomes you seek to measure, what success looks like, what you're trying to incentivize, and what the metrics are?
I also very much like that quote, and as an economist, arguably I've spent my life in other pursuits as well. But in
my second favorite adage is, if you could take all the economists of the world and lay them end to end, it would be a good thing.
And one of my great frustrations is I only have 2 hands. Often I wish I had 3. But in terms of what we're measuring, again, it's development impact. So what is the implication of these projects in the lives of real people? And that can be some of these disadvantaged populations that Representative Moore has highlighted. It's also the business communities. How are they helping to facilitate small and medium-sized enterprise development and a business climate in these countries that is supportive and helpful? And then there's a whole set of issues about the global commons that I mentioned. Are we delivering global public goods? And then as you think about that on a country level, then it aggregates up into, what are the implications of these policies for the global economy, for global growth, for the global environment, for global poverty reduction, and then ultimately to the United States and U.S. growth and U.S. employment. So I think of it as in some sense, an escalating set of issues of rising generality. But in the first instance, we have to say, what does this mean for individual people inside the countries where the project's being done?
GDP growth, small business growth, income growth, business climate as measured.
Poverty reduction.
Poverty alleviation. So, Undersecretary, you've often warned about the potential negative impacts on U.S. global leadership if we don't stay in the game, if we don't meet our obligations or our commitments to participate in the international financial institutions. Putting this in a broader context, I think about the seeds of the MDBs being sown at Bretton Woods, and especially when combined with the Marshall Plan, we were hugely motivated just in part by altruism, but also we were seeking to avoid warfare. And I think that was one of the hard lessons between World War I and World War II. We were also seeking to do all the things you just talked about in order to create markets for our own goods. And I guess what I want you to talk about is why it is in our self-interest, leave altruism aside for the time being, why is it in our self-interest to pursue participation, robust participation in international financing institutions?
I think you made many of the arguments quite candidly there. Ultimately, what the international financial institutions are about is developing strong, stable, economically and militarily, and stable and secure countries around the world. And as we see that achieved, that means more opportunities for U.S. exporters. It means more U.S. jobs. It means stronger global growth. It means more opportunities for U.S. investment. The MDBs, I think their track record over the last 70 years is that they have contributed to these kinds of things: global stability, global growth, and rising opportunity for people around the world, which in turn creates rising opportunities, rising demand, and opportunities in the United States.
And it is therefore in our self-interest, sir?
Strongly. And let me, consistent with that, just say that since the IMF quota money was paid to the IMF, our ability to be able to influence that institution in a way that's consistent with U.S. objectives has been greatly enhanced. So it's a concrete example of what you're speaking about.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, the chair recognizes Mrs. Love of Utah for 5 minutes.
Hello, how are you? Mr. Sheets, thank you for being here. Many assume that the MBDs are poverty-fighting institutions, and even though their non-concessional lending to middle-income countries can equal or exceed loans to poor governments. It was reported this month that the IBRD, the World Bank lending arm to the middle-income countries, is expected to have a banner year pushing $25 to $30 billion out the door at levels unseen since the financial crisis. So by definition, a non-concessional borrower at the MBDs is more creditworthy than poor countries borrowing from a soft loan window. So Mr. Sheets, why should, in your thoughts, why should taxpayers guarantee loans to countries that have access to capital markets anyway?
This is a very important question. First of all, let me emphasize that the terms that are extended to middle-income countries by the MDBs are different than those that are extended to poor countries by the MDBs. The MDBs' interactions with the poor countries are more likely to have a significant grant element to them, so just an outright passing of resources, and would be given at a lower interest rate than would be the case for middle-income countries. In terms of the case for lending to middle-income countries, my sense is that even in these middle-income countries, they have significant fractions of those that are still in poverty. Mm-hmm. And focusing lending on the poorest in these institutions, in these countries, is something that is of great importance.
So first of all, to the first point you were making, we're still pushing $25 to $30 billion out the door. So
yes,
in terms of sheer numbers, that's one that
yes, substantial.
But also, I've heard the argument already that I've heard this argument about the different areas in some of these larger countries that are experiencing extreme poverty. But it essentially means that China, India, and other large countries that still have many citizens that are living in extreme poverty. You have to understand that to us, we understand what's going on there. And China and India have ample resources that can benefit their own citizens. For instance, China still has over $3 trillion in reserves and has itself established not just one, but 2 development banks. So again, I've heard that I need to have some sort of other reason because, like my colleague said, every dollar that we spend in some of these countries is a dollar that we're not spending in countries that may need those resources.
So specifically with the case of China, but others as well, as I indicated in my remarks, we are vigorously engaged with these countries, emphasizing to them what their responsibilities are in the global system. And last summer, as we were negotiating with the Chinese in the run-up to the summit between President Xi and President Obama, one of the key deliverables that we achieved with the Chinese was them making a commitment that over time they would increasingly be contributors to these institutions and decreasingly be using them. But you know, by the same token, as I said, my sense is there's still tens of millions of poor in China. When the MDBs come, they bring international best practice. There's learning by doing in a number of different dimensions. So I think there is a case for the MDBs being in the middle income countries, but it's also important as they have resources that they become contributors and that they taper off their borrowing.
Do you have a specific matrix or any set criteria for evaluating when a middle income country no longer needs multilateral development assistance?
That is actually a vigorous debate inside of these institutions that's under the rubric of graduation. When should countries graduate from being borrowers at the MDBs? And there are
I would think that would actually be a priority, especially because, like I said, we've got taxpayer dollars going into. We have to be able to justify.
Yeah, we have been strong advocates of graduation when that's appropriate.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. With that.
All 4 seconds. All 4 seconds.
All 4 seconds, yes. Very generous of you. We appreciate your efficiency. With that, we welcome the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. And I apologize, I just came in. If some of these questions, I really have only 2 areas I want to explore, if they've already covered them. But if I could ask you to comment on some research that we have seen that shows investing in education of young women and girls has an incredible rate of return. Talk to me about the extent to which MDBs are focused on that particular question, especially in light of real questions about economic growth actually being dragged down by the lack of full participation of populations in local economies, especially in developing parts of the world, and what levers, what tools can be used to ensure gender equality when it comes to access, first to education, but then to other aspects of a nation's economy.
So I very much share your view, and I think that institutionally the Treasury shares the view that education and encouraging strong education around the world is absolutely crucial. It's a key part of the development process, raising the expertise and the human capital of the public. We would further categorically agree with you that bringing women and girls into the education system and into the labor force is absolutely essential. We can look around the world and see countries that are quite advanced, as well as countries that are not advanced at all economically, that are not adequately using the capacities and the employment capabilities of women. And it's imperative, especially as we think about an aging global demographic, that women be used have opportunities in the labor force completely and fully. Now, consistent with what I'm saying, education, and particularly education of women and girls, is a key priority of the MDBs. It was one of the key priorities of the Financing for Development conference that was held last summer. It is at the center of the work programs in all of the MDBs. It's something that all of them are committed to achieving. Maintaining adequate resources for that are important. There is also another aspect of it, and that is a safeguards aspect of making sure that as projects are implemented, that this objective of bringing in and allowing fair participation regardless of gender in projects, and that people are protected, that's also an important aspect of it as well.
Thank you. And I wonder if you, just switching gears, if you could make any comment on the challenges, particularly in developing countries, regarding clean drinking water. I have a particular interest in the subject. I represent Flint, Michigan. I'm also often looking for some corollaries between the global challenges we face and, sadly, some of the unique challenges that we face in really distressed communities in our own country. But could you comment on the extent to which MDBs have been able to focus on the development of drinking water systems that don't absolutely have to have a market basis in order to be sustained? That's one of the big challenges, particularly in areas of high poverty.
This is also of great importance. I think that Representative Moore referred to access to water as being a human right, and I very much share that view. Water projects, sanitation projects, et cetera, are core to the MDBs. And in fact, when I think about the restructuring that Jim Kim did at the World Bank, where he reorganized the bank from focusing on regions to focusing on practice areas and areas of emphasis, one of those core areas that he's focused on is water, and ensuring access and management and sanitation and so on and so forth. The other point that I would make is I think the North American Development Bank, its mission of environmental infrastructure along the U.S.-Mexican border is also very relevant here, of ensuring adequate access to water and sanitation and so forth in all parts of the United States. So I think there are a number of different dimensions here, and they're very important.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired. I thank the chairman and ranking member for this hearing, and yield back my time.
Chairman appreciates your just self-policing there on your time. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Schweikert of Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, just a whole series of quick questions just for education and dialogue. What's the most successful practice you believe that you've seen different development banks engage in to deal with corruption?
I think what we're seeing in the AML-CFT space right now is quite extraordinary, and the MDBs are working on it. We at Treasury have technical assistance.
Describe to me what the practice is.
So it's let me describe, the MDBs have technical assistance that's similar. Let me describe what we're doing in the space. It's similar. Is we have projects in 17 countries, and many other countries have requested it, where we send in teams of specialists who know bank supervision and how to root out unsavory transactions, and sit down with their counterparts in developing countries and teach them how to do it. So it's really a hands-on technology transfer.
Okay.
And I think that that's a key, is you need to be hands-on. Can't just pass a handbook. It's got to be.
And with that, going the right direction, would you oppose, as we're getting ready to recapitalize and try to make sure we're doing things the right way, to also put in sort of the bad actor provisions, that these individuals cannot, touch the money?
That bad actors, along with the AML-CFT, the bad actors.
I mean, we have our classic examples of some of the assistance to Ukraine, and we know certain folks managing the money are the very people that we're also investigating for having done something dodgy.
Absolutely. And in Ukraine, as we have interacted with them in the context of the IMF program and also the loan
Yeah, and
guarantees.
I was just using them as an example.
Yes.
I mean, it's
We've been
a
emphatic
worldwide phenomenon.
about fighting corruption and making sure the bad actors aren't the ones that are in a position of applying.
In some of the literature, there's discussion about also trying to design the system so it's direct payments to contractors. Instead of it flowing through the partner country, that payment goes directly to the concrete company that delivered the concrete, or those sorts of things. Almost like if you were doing a development, let's say you were building some condos here or something of that nature, your bank on occasion would pay directly to your individual trades or contractors.
Yeah.
Is that comfortable?
I think the empirical literature on this suggests that to the extent you can make the payment directly to the source and cut out various administrative layers, unsurprisingly, that gives you much better results.
Okay, so we already come up with like 2 or 3 at least conceptual reforms that we both like. Last one, and this one's a little more ethereal, but I think has a much grander scheme. There's a number of us here who've been talking about for a couple of years, and the idea of one of the most powerful things we could ever do in development aid is actually how do you get the money down to the population that is in most need of, is most in the categories of poverty. Okay, we've all seen we all grew up hearing the stories of the micro-lending in Bangladesh and those things. I'm talking the next level where I have even some of my poorest populations walking around with some versions of smartphones, where the smartphone is also their bank. How do I basically, I'll use the term eBay for trade, and how do we use both a combination of technology and our resources to build that platform? So if I'm here in North America and I go online and there's a small village in middle of Myanmar that carves tables, that I can buy that directly from them, use this technology to send the money directly to them without the graft, bakshish, whatever you want to call it, being skimmed off the top or big, huge portions of it disappearing. And that sort of bilateral trade with the folks in most need of it using our current technology. What do you believe your agency and organization would be willing to do to help us bring that about?
Yeah. So one frame on that is how to build micro-nationals around the world. One place where we've seen this happening and where the Treasury and the MDBs have been involved is in India, where the population has hundreds of millions of cell phones, and they're using those cell phones to connect into the financial system and to enhance financial inclusion.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but those 4 things the 3 about corruption and 1 about sort of the resources also going directly to the folks we intend to help by trading with them and building a platform to do that. Those are all ideas I'd like to present to you in writing at some point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We appreciate that. And if it's all right with you, Secretary Sheets, the ranking member and I have discussed doing a brief second round as well, which may just consist of a couple of us. But I had a couple of follow-up questions. And we want to be mindful of your time as well. But with that, pursuant to our rules, when we don't have anybody on the other side of the aisle present, we will go to the next person on the majority side, which is Mr. Emmer from New Mexico. I'm sorry, from Minnesota. A little different, similar.
They're not that
abbreviations.
close, Mr.
Yes.
Chair. Thank you.
NM and MN. I had that backwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for holding this hearing, and thank you to the Undersecretary for joining us this morning. We're here today, as I understand it, to discuss the World Bank and the 4 regional MDBs because the Treasury is currently negotiating a replenishment of the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And the term replenishment is really another way of saying what Americans are being asked to contribute. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And there is a paid-in amount, and then there's an overall commitment, correct?
There are two modalities through which these contributions are made. One is through capital increase, which would be the called in, but there are also in the concessional windows that are used to support the poor.
But if I can interrupt, Mr.
There we
Undersecretary.
make contributions directly.
That's not where I'm going. I'm just asking if it's not true that we have a paid-in amount that the United States will actually deliver in cash. Where it goes, I'm not
Correct.
concerned right now. And then there is an overall commitment, the number that we've got capital on call, if you will.
Yeah,
correct?
and I was just saying, particularly at the World Bank, I think of it as two accounts. The GCI, the paid-in capital requirement to the balance sheet, that's not on the table now. Now we have the IDA, which would go to support the poorest through concessional lending and grants.
And I appreciate the clarification. For the past 3 years, because my understanding is now every 3 years we've got to do this, and let's just talk about the World Bank. What was the overall amount paid in by the United States as opposed to what was the overall commitment?
So my recollection, we have that number. Okay, so the overall replenishment for IDA 3 years ago was $52 billion.
Okay.
And the United States paid in 3.9. And these were payments to the to the concessional window for the poorest.
Got it. So now we're talking about the next 3 years. Treasury is proposing what for the paid-in amount, the overall commitment? Let's do it the other way.
We are now in vigorous negotiations with foreign counterparts as to where this thing might land. My instinct is that the next replenishment is going to look broadly similar in terms of size to where we were before.
All right. Now, the two of the goals of the World Bank, one, end extreme poverty, and two, push for greater equity. Now, I think that as part of the goal of ending poverty in underdeveloped and developing countries to lift their standard of living around the globe, the World Bank, the idea is it facilitates the availability of capital to deploy on projects that these underdeveloped and developing countries can use to develop, for instance, their transportation infrastructure, correct?
Absolutely.
And their water and sewer infrastructure, their energy infrastructure, their communication infrastructure, all of these things, right?
All of the above.
And as I was reading it conceptually, you know, my colleague from Michigan earlier talked about the important foreign policy considerations of making sure that we have stable countries around the globe, that their standard of living is rising, not only so that they can trade with the United States and others, but so we can develop a relationship that perhaps doesn't lead to conflict down the road. That's one of the purposes.
Yes, exactly.
But it's also to an advance, isn't it? It's also a part of what the administration, whoever is in charge, uses to advance their global agenda, isn't it?
There are policy judgments that are made.
Well, and let's
Absolutely.
talk about that quick, because in the time I have left, the loans that are being made, whether they're to middle-income countries or to the lower, those that need the help in the concessional window, the loans aren't just based on an ability to pay and a plan as to how to pay. The World Bank makes a decision as to whether or not this project is worthy based on social considerations as well as an ability to pay.
Yeah, well, I would say inevitably there's a prioritization.
Well, I'll be very specific. My understanding is that the World Bank will not facilitate financing for a hydroelectric development in a developing nation at this point.
I have no basis to, as far as I know, that it can.
It can.
Yeah, why?
That isn't the point.
I don't think
It can do a lot of things, but my point is, there has been a decision made somewhere that it will not facilitate loans for hydroelectric development.
The Power Africa is about bringing all various kinds of power into Africa.
Well, and I see my time's expired. If we can just do this, Mr. Undersecretary,
Yes.
going forward, can I get with your office and get a list?
Yes.
Somewhere it's got to be written down what is appropriate, what's not.
Yes, and I'd be happy to chat with you offline as
Thank you.
well.
I'd appreciate that.
Thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I would remind the gentleman that he can also submit written questions to the chair, and we will forward those on and be able to get some of those answers on the record that would be probably illuminating for everybody. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
and without objection, we are going to move to a second round of questioning. And with that, the chair recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your indulgence and patience with us, Undersecretary Sheets. I don't want to belabor the point here, but we have talked a lot about accountability and transparency at these institutions. And I'm wondering, and I know that I'm very impressed with the fact that we've been able to get some sort of cooperation among and between these multi-development banks. But I'm wondering, are we able to sort of export our concerns about corruption and so on to these other banks, to the extent that they're independent, but they've carved out their separate roles for development in their regions? To what extent are we able to enforce safeguards and transparency among the banks? What is that mechanism?
So we are the largest shareholder in the World Bank, but we are also the largest shareholder in all of the regional development banks, with the exception of the African Development Bank, where Nigeria is number 1 and we're number 2. So in each one of these...
What about the Asian Development Bank?
Asian Development Bank, we and the Japanese have the same share, so we're co-largest in that institution. So we are a very significant voice in the boards of all of those institutions. And in all of those institutions, we vigorously advocate for the kinds of things that we've talked about today. And as a result of our advocacy and through the choice of leadership of the institutions, I think we've been quite effective in raising this as a key goal for these institutions to achieve. Of course, there's always work to be done to achieve the goal more effectively. But
what about BRIC?
What's that?
The BRIC.
The BRICS Bank.
The BRIC multi-development bank.
Yes.
The BRIC countries.
I would, with the BRICS Bank, the key shareholders are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And that is a new institution that they have recently established. There, our influence has to be more indirect. And it's a matter of engaging with that institution and with those countries and encouraging them to pursue these policies. The BRICS Bank hasn't made any loans yet, so it's too early to say whether or not they'll follow these practices. But my sense is that these practices are good policy, and the case for them is very strong. So we will continue to persuade them to follow it.
Because are we anticipating participating in loans with the BRIC funds?
As the BRICS banks have acceptable loans, I think that the MDBs would consider that. But I'd say, given the more limited shareholdership in that institution, that's somewhat less likely than co-financing with the AIIB, where many more countries around the world are actually members.
We should watch this very carefully.
Indeed, yes, we are.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. And with that, the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes as we wrap this up. Undersecretary Sheets, on page 2 of your written testimony, you talk about the NAD Bank. and how it's unique. And in that end of that first paragraph, the NAD's financing, NAD Bank's financing of projects in areas like wastewater collection and treatment, solid waste management, and air quality improvement enhance the quality of life and protect the environment and communities on both sides of the border. There is, however, evidence, and I have a chart in front of me here, that that 2/3 of the financing of the NAD Bank is in wind and solar. And I think that goes back to my colleague, Mr. Pittenger's question. And being from Michigan as well, and my mother being from Flint originally, I'm very concerned about what's been happening with Flint and what Mr. Kildee was talking about. And it seems to me that maybe NAD Bank has really pulled itself off of its core, its core intent: wastewater collection and treatment, solid waste management, air quality improvement. And as I recall, with NAFTA passing early in the Clinton administration, that was a major, major concern, was you were going to have companies shifting across the border and then having all their environmental regulations taken off, a shared watershed along the Rio Grande, that things were just going to be dumped in there. And the idea of the NAD Bank was to be going in and making sure that there was the infrastructure, whether it's drinking water, sanitation, roads, all of those different things. Not 2/3 of its portfolio in solar and wind power. And so I think it begs the question, I mean, aren't they pulling those dollars away from some of that vital infrastructure that even Mr. Kildee was talking about?
So my understanding is that, that they are operating consistent with their mandate, which is environmental infrastructure. Part of that is ensuring reliable power sources.
Would you acknowledge that's maybe a little broader definition of what environmental infrastructure might be than it was in 1993, I guess it was, when this was passed? I mean, we didn't have massive wind farms envisioned at that point.
Right. But I would think that it would include, on the one hand, ensuring sustainable energy for the region, and also ensuring reliable energy for the region. But as you say, I mean, these other functions of water and sanitation and roads and so on and so forth are also of great importance.
Okay, and I want to, in the last remaining 2 minutes here, I want to hit on the BRICS banks and the AIIB as well. And I'm very concerned and curious. Will the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and BRICS Bank hold borrowers to the same standards that these other MDBs, and transparency? Give me a comment on that, and then, given the turbulent economic state of China, Brazil, Russia, you name it, with what's happening there, what is their impact at this point?
On the AIIB and holding borrowers to the same standards, that is the core, the crux of our engagement with the Chinese on this issue, is pressing for approaches and lending modalities that are consistent with these best practices that we've discussed in this.
Is there any reason to believe, though, that they are going to follow through on that? Much like they don't adhere to their own to our standards on their own air pollution standards, for example.
The written documents that have been produced are broadly consistent with international best practice, so I would say that's a positive. And there are countries, and we're working with them as well, who are members of the AIIB who are pushing. So we're pushing the Chinese directly, and we're also working with those that are members to push on the board. And then a third modality to achieve this outcome is for them to co-finance with the MDBs, in the sense that if they are coming together and doing projects jointly, they will inherit all of these safeguards and practices that we described. But this is a key issue. We are watching it very closely, and will continue to emphasize to the Chinese the necessity of following through. I guess one other point here that's material to your question is during the summit in September between President Xi and President Obama, the Chinese committed to ensure that the practices of the AIIB would be consistent with best standards.
Okay. And with that, my time has expired, and we'd like to welcome Mr. Meeks of New York here for round two. And I think you will be our final questioner. So with that, the chair recognizes Mr. Meeks of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Mr. Stevens, Mr. Sheets, excuse me. Mr. Sheets, let me good morning to you. I've been watching and working with and following the work of the MDBs for a while, being on this committee for a long period of time, longer than I care to think. And I have no doubt in my mind that their mission is absolutely essential for combating poverty and for the most vulnerable regions, and that is absolutely essential for our own national interests, both economically and for our security. But I'm not sure if they are doing enough, and that institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have the capacity to do enough to drastically reduce poverty. You know, the World Bank and other MDBs are currently looking for ways to leverage the equity from their concessional window so that they can do more in terms of grants and concessional loans. And I support these initiatives, but I want to make sure that greater concessional support would be accompanied by better governance. I think that not just at the project level, but also at the country level. And what I want to do is so that we can set an example, so that if you see better governance happening, other countries can see that if you do better, then the likelihood of them getting the support would be great. So, and that will help and have a huge impact on reducing poverty. So I was wondering if could you give me a comment on that?
I broadly agree with your assessment. First, it's important for us to continue to think of ways to better utilize and leverage the resources of these institutions, particularly with an eye to continuing to meet the needs of the poorest countries. As we discussed earlier, we've seen that achieved with some success at the Asian Development Bank, and there's now a process ongoing at the World Bank thinking about how to better deploy the IDA resources and how those resources might be better used to meet the needs of both developing and other countries. The other part of your question, I think, very much cuts to the importance of safeguards and ensuring that the lending processes are high quality and incorporating the experience of the past. And not only that we articulate that up front as being important, but that actually once these projects are in place and completed, that resources be allocated to ensure that the safeguards have been followed, so that there is a focus not only on articulating good safeguards, but on implementing them and monitoring them after the fact to make sure that the countries that are involved, the companies that are involved, the workers and so on and so forth that are involved are following through on those best practices. As you say, the countries that are following through and implementing are the ones that should be rewarded with additional financing and should be given priority. I've talked about this prioritization process, and in some sense you have to prioritize across sectors, you also have to prioritize across countries. And those countries that are following through and engaged are the ones that should be given priority for more funding going forward.
All right, I concur with you. Let me also ask, Director Lagarde has recently been very clear that her institution at the IMF lacks the resources to respond to potential emerging market debt crises, which is now an emerging risk in the face of the commodities prices slump and currencies devaluations that we have seen across many of the regions. She has called, for example, for currency swap lines with central banks and credit lines with the MDB so that developing countries can reallocate some of their foreign reserves to local investments. And I was just wondering, has the Treasury looked into this request at all?
So our sense is that with the passage of the quota reforms that were agreed to in 2010 and then recently completed this year, that the IMF is well resourced and is in a position where it is able and should be able to respond to the challenges that emerging markets and developing countries face. Now, in addition to the discussion of the size of the IMF's balance sheet, there's also a discussion of what's being called global financial safety nets. So is there some way to provide an additional kind of backstop for emerging market economies and developing countries to give them liquidity during a time of stress? The IMF provides some of that through its flexible credit lines, or FCL, but is there some way, working together, the international community can provide additional support? My sense is that to date, those discussions are very preliminary, and we haven't yet seen a way forward that makes sense.
Gentleman's time has expired, and we welcome an additional member of the committee here, Mr. Hinojosa of Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huizinga and Ranking Member Moore. Oh, forgive me.
Please proceed.
I want to thank you and Ranking Member Moore for holding this hearing on development banks. I can say that today's schedule is extremely packed, and I've been at 2 others that I just had to speak because I had some bills there. I want to take this opportunity to ask a question that is on a subject that involves the banks. Here it is. That involves the banks that I'm so interested in. So I can say that over history of the Nat Bank, located in San Antonio and serving Mexico and the United States, has financed 218 projects with only 26 in the area of renewable energy, including wind and solar, which is a slight 11%. In fact, over the last 5 years, 41 of those projects have been completed in the area of water and wastewater, while only 18 clean and renewable projects have been completed. Few, if any, have that record that I just read to you, but the benefits that are being received by the constituents and on my side of the Texas Congressional District, and then, of course, the people from Mexico, where these projects were done, have improved quality of life in a way that is easy to see and appreciate. My question is, how does NatBank financing renewable projects help the bank accomplish its mission, as well as produce economic development and opportunity for the impoverished communities along the United States-Mexico border?
So we very much share the assessment of the NAD Bank that you articulated, that it's been a powerful source of development along both sides of the border, and that there's clear additionality here with this institution that's able to do projects in the United States as well as in Mexico, and work directly with municipalities and so forth in ways that the other MDBs would not be able to do. Now, consistent with the mandate for environmental infrastructure, there's, as you indicated, very important to focus on water and sanitation and roads and so on and so forth along the border, but also sustainable, reliable sources of energy are a very important objective in the economic development of that region. So that's how we would see that fitting into that broader mandate.
Dr. Sheets, how is the NatBank accountable to the United States for our portion?
So we along with the Mexican government, the U.S. government and the Mexican government are the shareholders, and so we would, we would be on the board of those institutions and manage them.
The monies that are used at NatBank are half put in half from the United States and one half from the Mexican government.
Correct.
And I've been talking to friends on both sides of the aisle, and they seem to be very impressed with the quality of the projects and the success that they've had, how they've benefited. And so we've asked for an increase so that it'll be $6 million, half and half, both governments. Do you support that?
Very, very much so, that this capital increase would allow the NAB Bank to continue to lend at a pace of $200 to $250 million a year, which is essentially where it's been in recent years. Our sense is that the demand along the border is quite substantial, and the need there is significant. Also, as you indicate, our counterparts in Mexico look at this as a very important signal of our bilateral commitment and our capacity of the two governments to work together, which is something that we see as being very important.
I appreciate that kind of support. Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter the NAT Bank's 2014 annual report and Moody's 2015 rating of the NAT Bank into the record for today's hearing.
Without objection, and you actually beat me to the punch.
With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I was going to request the same to point out the charts that NAD Bank itself had submitted for 2013 and 2014 as far as their total dollar infrastructure spent, 36.6% in wind energy and 26.5% in solar energy in 2013, 36.3% in wind energy and 28.8% in solar energy in 2014. So those were their own numbers, which we're comparing apples and oranges when 26 of those projects accounted for 2/3 of the total funding that they utilize. So without objection, the NAD Bank 2014 annual report will be submitted. So, and I'd like to thank our witness today for his testimony, the Honorable Dr. Nathan Sheets. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for their response. I ask Undersecretary Sheets and your team to please respond as promptly as you possibly are able to, and actually then shorten that by a day.
Fair enough.
Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record as well. And with no further objection, this hearing is adjourned.